Well, Formula One is back. 14 weeks, 98 days since that controversial season ender in Abu Dhabi, and it's back with a bang here in Bahrain. Ferrari are back on the top step of the podium. In fact, it's a 1-2, as it was the last time Ferrari won a race. That was back in 2019 in Singapore, would you believe? This time, Charles Leclerc leading home teammate Carlos Sainz, and that was the 19th Formula One race at the 5.4 kilometre Sakir circuit, the 1058th Formula One World Championship race. Welcome to the Go F1 show. I'm your host, Matthew Marsh. It's great to have you with us for this Bahrain Grand Prix debrief. And to help us break down most of the 57 laps of that Grand Prix, a familiar face for race fans across the Asia region, the former F1 driver, Alex Young, joining us from Kuala Lumpur. Alex, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us, of course. Are you excited as I am?
So excited. I mean, what a great first race. I mean, Ferrari genuinely there, got their first win in, like you said, 2019. Looks like we generally have a three-way fight for the championship because Mercedes will get better. But the drama, what drama? Who would have expected Red Bull to have such a shocker? And for both the Red Bull cars got just before the end of the race. Wow. Wow. How about that?
Well, how about that three-way fight for the championship? We're going to have a three-way discussion this evening. Our special guest this time around is Craig Scarborough, because we're seeing the biggest technical regulations change in a generation. So good for us to have somebody who's covered the technical development of Formula One for more than 2 decades. Scarbs, as he is known, is a prolific content creator. You've probably seen his work on Formula One's Tech Talks. You might have seen him in the past in Autosport magazine. He's a regular guest on Peter Windsor's excellent YouTube channel. Technical illustrations and 3D animations are Craig's forte, and he's also rather excellent, as you're going to find out tonight, with insight and opinion. So welcome to Craig Scarborough from sunny England.
It's sunny, yes, which is lovely in England. And yeah, as Alex says, what a race. I mean, my notes pages are absolutely full from what happened at the front to all the way at the back of the grid. So much to learn about the cars and these new regulations and all the technology that sits underneath it. It's absolutely fascinating.
Fantastic. Well, before we kick off with our discussion, let's have a look at the results for the 2022 Bahrain Grand Prix. Of course, it's the first round of a 23-race World Championship. There it is. There's the top 10. Charles Leclerc for Ferrari, ahead of his teammate Carlos Sainz. Lewis Hamilton was third. George Russell in fourth. Kevin Magnussen for Haas, believe it or not, in fifth. Valtteri Bottas for Alfa Romeo, sixth. Esteban Ocon for Alpine, seventh. Yuki Tsunoda for Alpha Tauri is eighth. Fernando Alonso for Alpine, ninth. And Guan Yu Zhou, or Zhou Guan Yu, for Alfa Romeo, scoring points on his first Formula One Grand Prix. Mick Schumacher, his best ever result, 11th for the Haas team. Lance Stroll is 12th. Alexander Albon is 13th for Williams. Daniel Ricciardo, 14th for McLaren. Lando Norris right behind him in the other McLaren. Nicholas Latifi, 16th for Williams. Nico Hulkenberg, 17th, standing in for Sebastian Vettel at Aston Martin. Then Sergio Perez, Max Verstappen, and Pierre Gasly were the non-finishers. Those are the results, gentlemen. The big story, I suppose, for the Bahrain Grand Prix is the Red Bull DNFs, the two Red Bulls failing to finish. Craig, we'll go to you first because technical is kind of your department. Any idea what caused those failures?
I've got some ideas, but I haven't really got a definitive answer because there's some sort of confusion as to the pattern of what happened on each of the cars. You have to remember there was actually 3 Red Bull powertrains that failed in this race because Gasly's car broke down, caused the safety car in the first place, and oddly caught fire. So I'm kind of trying to connect the dots to find out what happened. But certainly the main retirement reason seems to be the hybrid system, because you complete electrical shutdown. You saw the steering wheels go off, the engine stopped, and that typically means that something fundamental has happened either with the battery or the electronics in the hybrid system. Then you think, well, why did Gasly have a fire? Why did Verstappen have the steering issue? And they may be just, coincidental, but there may be something more into it. I just haven't kind of worked that out yet. But it's unusual that they happened so close to each other, literally within a matter of laps, a few kilometers of each other, when during testing, these cars have covered huge amounts of mileage, despite the very short amount of testing, just 6 days that they have between the shakedown and the official Bahrain test, thousands of kilometers, and just when it mattered most, three of their powertrains let them down. So it's really unusual, and it'd be interesting to when Red Bull powertrains kind of tell us a bit more of exactly what's happened there.
And Alex, 23 race season. So how important is it for Red Bull not to have scored any points in the opening round?
Well, I mean, we saw last year how nip and tuck it was between Hamilton and Verstappen. One race could be quite critical, but there are a lot of races. If you are going to have a DNF, it's always good to have it in the beginning of the season because you can react. You can always try and get those points back. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to be incredibly disappointing, but I think Red Bull are going to be more disappointed by trying to figure out what happened, like Craig said. Then yes, they'll be disappointed about obviously losing the points for second position and fourth position for the two Red Bulls, but they can recover that. There are a lot of races to go, but there'll be a lot of head scratching going on. It is kind of unusual when these sort of things happen. In my experience, when you see something like that, it's often finger problems sometimes that could happen, software related issues back in my day. Yes, sure, there'll be a lot of unhappy faces at the Red Bull garage tonight.
I did actually think during that race, when I heard about Max Verstappen having what appeared to be, at some point we thought maybe was a power steering problem. I think actually it might have been a steering rod issue, but when it was a power steering problem, I thought Alex Young never had power steering when he was racing in Formula One, so he didn't ever had a problem with it failing.
Yeah,
but,
easy.
Putting that aside for a second, but only a second, Craig, putting aside the fact they didn't finish the race and they didn't score any points, but how impressed or otherwise were you with the Red Bull cars in terms of performance? Were you surprised they couldn't beat the Ferraris?
I was a little surprised. I mean, I had Verstappen down as a kind of a slam dunk winner for this race, so I was a bit confused when he wasn't able to make that maneuver off the start. And the Ferraris had a particularly good second phase to their start. Both of the cars worked really well there. And then, at the end of the stints, and certainly you could see that Max was being told to hold back on the outlap to look after the tyres, to manage, and it caused problems with brake warm up at the same time. So, I think there's more to come from Red Bull than perhaps we saw in performance during the race. But I'm sure they'll take heart that they're absolutely there. There's no sort of question marks that they were showboating during testing. They really are the team arguably to beat. I think Ferrari certainly have kind of overperformed throughout the race, particularly in Leclerc's hands. And again, we go back and start to look at the second drivers, both sides, who had a bit of an off race weekend. Largely, obviously, he was much better in qualifying, but again, we saw that the Ferrari engine really came alive in qualifying, which is something we've not seen for a few years. And then Perez, you have to look at that and think, well, really he was only brought fully into contention by, issues with other cars. And, that first corner really kind of wrecked his race, but the car didn't have enough really to recover rapidly. And he really should have been right behind Verstappen and ahead of Sainz through that race. So, yeah, I think they've got be happy, but I think there's apart from the reliability, as you say, there are other things that they will want to have a look at there and think, we need to go and put that right.
It's actually great news, isn't it, Alex, that we've got a proper three-way team fight. Well, certainly a two-way between Ferrari and Red Bull.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to ask Craig's opinion about this, actually, because what's quite interesting about the Ferrari? I mean, we know how traction is very important, looking after the rear tires is very important here in Bahrain. And there's been a lot of talk about how good the Ferrari engines are, aren't they? It's good to Steiner now thinks the Ferrari's got the best power unit on the grid. And you couldn't argue against that, could you? All three of their teams made it into Q3. So that was certainly very impressive. And, there's been a lot of talk as well about the traction, the power delivery of those power units out of those slow corners has been very impressive. And I think that could have been a key part of the win tonight. Because you could see that the pace of the Ferrari and the Red Bull were very similar at the beginning of the stints, but definitely the Red Bulls were not looking after the tires as well. Verstappen constantly complaining that he had no traction, zero traction, I think is what he said a couple of times. So that certainly lends that argument, the strength to that argument that Ferrari have very good power delivery in those cars at the moment.
And I'm
Yeah, and
getting
it's
a couple
something.
of. Sorry, go ahead, Craig.
All right. I was going to say, we really kind of saw this Ferrari Renaissance. If we think back to kind of, 2019 when they were last successful, then they had that awful 2020 going into 21. And then there was that mid-season hybrid update last year that really kind of gave the Ferrari literally like a kind of a zap under acceleration, which is when the hybrid system really pays off, because you get the torque of the MG UK really delivering that power out of corners. Over the winter, they've then been able to further develop the combustion engine, and as a package, they've come together this year. And it's very early, but you could say at the moment they have got the best performing engine on circuit. Now, I don't think that is necessarily going to be the case throughout the year. Certainly, the Honda is very good, and Mercedes, I have a sneaking suspicion that Mercedes have probably kept their engine turned down because they've got so many other issues. I wonder, and again, it goes back to this reliability question that we said earlier, that they've decided maybe we haven't got the chassis, but rather than just turning the engine up to the full beans to give them, that extra pace, particularly with the porpoising problems, they've decided to turn the engine down, extend the engine, as we say, it's a 23 race season, potentially 23 races. They've only got, the 4 power units, and, Red Bull are already potentially one hybrid package down. So managing them through the year, managing the budget through the year is going to be a big issue. But definitely at the moment, Ferrari are able to exploit that power unit, not just in the factory car, as we saw today, and as Alex said, the Haas and the Alfa Romeo, which are both very good looking chassis. I mean, when you look at the design aspect of them, there's nothing lacking in them compared with anybody else. And we certainly know that Haas have put a huge amount of effort into the development of the chassis over the past 2 years because of how they tackled last year with no development. But then having this, absolutely bomber, as the Italians used to call it, engine in the back of the cars, really kind of bringing those packages. And the race results speak for themselves. 2 Alfa Romeos in the top 10 and 5th for a Haas. No disrespect to the teams, but there is a big aspect of that is that power unit.
Yeah, how lovely to see it as well.
And 2 good points you made there, I think, actually, which is that first I'm taking away is that more than the points that Red Bull have lost today, it's the fact that they might now be very much out of sync in terms of engine use over a 23 race season. And the second point, well, the Ferrari engine power unit situation and versus Mercedes maybe keeping their powder dry. But let's move on to Mercedes, because we need to talk a little bit about Lewis Hamilton. He only spent, I think I'm right in saying, 5 laps in P3, but it was the right time to be in P3. Certainly the last lap was the most important. How, Craig, first of all, and then we talk to Alex about this, how far behind are they really? Because I asked that question because on Monday, presumably the odds on Lewis winning the World Championship are going to be relatively attractive. And should we be attracted by those odds, do you think?
I think you may have missed the boat. I think if you should have bet last week on Lewis being champion, you probably got even better odds. That 3rd position, albeit fortuitous, does just show the strength that Mercedes has, and in these kind of times. But in some respects, if you look at the Mercedes performance, they really were behind all the way through this race. They weren't in contention for a podium at all, apart from 2 retirements in front of them, and the safety car bringing them so close in the first place anyway. So you've got that to worry. Equally, you've got someone like McLaren underperforming. Really, typically, McLaren would have been in front of Mercedes this weekend. They've obviously had a completely awful weekend, which is a totally different story. Mercedes are massively underperforming. They looked better in the race than I expected. I kind of had the feeling that they were going to have a race that just went backwards. And, we saw Hamilton try the hard tyres. It didn't work. I thought that really was the nail in the coffin for the weekend for them. But they managed to kind of claw that back. The car looked okay. It didn't look great, and it didn't look as big a handful. Certainly wasn't porpoising as much as we had seen through the early part of the weekend and the test last week. So I take heart from that, and I get the feeling that it will only be a few races before Mercedes are kind of back to where we would expect them to be fighting amongst the Red Bulls and clearly the Ferraris this year. And then, the rest of the season, it's going to be all to play for. So I wouldn't make any bold predictions based just on this one race, whether you look at just at the result or just the relative performances.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to echo what Craig's saying here, then, Matt. You know, they're not that far behind. And you can tell. Obviously trying to do some compromises with the setup, playing around with the floor, trying to stop that porpoising. Well, once they sort that out, they're going to find quite a bit of lap time quite quickly, I feel. They're not going to find it straight away. Saudi Arabia's too soon, but maybe by round 4, round 5, I think they'll be there. And there's still a lot of races to catch up. And it's not like it's not a 2-horse race. It's going to be a 3-horse race. So in those races, maybe they're not so competitive. I don't think it'll be Ferrari all the way. I think it'll be Red Bull and Ferrari taking points off each other. It's not like last year where if you're only racing one driver and that one driver's got 60 points on you, it's going to be really hard to catch up. It's not going to be like that this year, and Mercedes are definitely in the fight.
Well, those are the podium positions, and of course the notable retirees. Let's have a look now. We've got a very nice chart. It's called the race performance chart here on Go F1. It's a new invention that our friend Emma Black and Tessa have been working on in the last couple of days. Here it is. I like this one in particular because it shows relative to the starting position where they ended up. Of course, Charles Leclerc is perfect in black with the 0. That means that you won the race from the pole. But let's have a look at notable mentions here. I think one to talk about immediately, of course, is Yuki Tsunoda, because he scores the highest points there, 9 positions up. But it's basically because he had a relatively lowly qualifying position. I think the 2 topics we need to talk about now, gentlemen, if you agree, are Kevin Magnussen there in 5th, starting 7th, and Zhou Guanyu starting 16th and finishing 10th, scoring points on his F1 debut. Let's talk about Zhou first of all. Alex, your thoughts on that? Chinese driver, the first time in Formula 1, scoring points on his debut.
Very solid drive, very solid. He should be very happy with that. Great, and the team will be incredibly happy with his performance. We talked about this last year, Matt, didn't we, with Yuki Tsunoda? We said he needs to not attack too much in the beginning, because you build and you put this too much pressure, and if you start crashing, it just leads to more crashes, and the pressure just builds and builds. So that's the worst thing you could do. But the best thing really to do is to just try to have a nice, calm race and feel your way into it. That's what Zhou did. He had a steady race. Okay, he's good. The Alfa Romeo package is a good package, obviously, but quick as well in the race. His lap times were strong. Didn't have a great first lap, and in the end, his reward is some points. So that's job done today.
Craig, what about Kevin Magnussen, in particular Haas, actually?
Yeah.
Yes, it was the kind of the fairy tale that everyone hoped when Haas had thrown away so much of the past few seasons. 2020 they really didn't develop the car, and they pretty much just legalized that car for 21 in order to go racing. Did absolutely no development, so they could focus solely for these regulations. And you have to argue it's paid off. The car, looks great on track. Kevin, I think, has been a revelation coming back into the team. And when he was re-signed by Haas, I was kind of thinking, well, why? I thought they'd all fallen out, and is he really the best person to come back into the team? But clearly Haas knew that they had something with this package, with the chassis that they put together, with the Ferrari powertrain. And, in Kevin's hands today, it really did look, fantastic. And it's not at all where we've been used to Haas being for many years now. If we remember when they first came in, maybe this is what we would have expected from them. So, all credit to them. And let's see how that develops through the year, because no doubt the rest of the midfield are going to come back towards them as they sort themselves out. I mean, I thought Alpine were notably kind of there or thereabouts throughout sort of testing and this race. But you can't help but think that they will, start to make steps potentially quicker than someone like Haas would. You've got McLaren expected a resurgence. AlphaTauri, but equally, as you said there, a great performance in. So, I think Haas have got to make hay in this early part of the season, why they've got a true advantage there. And hopefully they can keep up the performance. You have to remember as well, with the aero time, the wind tunnel time, CFD time you've got this year, it's balanced between those that started the lowest and those that started the highest. Mercedes have the least wind tunnel time of everyone this year. Haas have got the most. And they can, if they can afford to use that wind tunnel time within their budget and the money they actually have in the bank available, then that bodes really well for them to keep pushing all the way through the season.
All the way through. Well, we're going to dig into the technical regulations in a bit more detail because we've got you, Craig, on the show, of course, other newsmakers to discuss as well. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick look now at how partner of the Go F1 show, WebEx by Cisco, helps their partner, McLaren Racing.
Late braking, what do you think?
Love it or no chance?
Daniel, no chance.
Let's put up a poll.
Love it, love it, love it wins.
We need that part.
It's nearly done.
Can you repeat that? That's better.
It's done.
With WebEx, the McLaren Formula One team is collaborating like never before. Introducing the WebEx Suite, driving hybrid work.
Welcome back. Now, let's have a quick look, if we can, at the World Drivers' Championship points as they stand after the first round of what is going to be 23 rounds of this World Championship, because we've already talked about the podium finishes, we've talked about the retiring Red Bulls, and here's what we've got so far. Charles Leclerc for Ferrari has 26 points, 25 for the win, and of course, 1 for the fastest lap. His teammate, Carlos Sainz for Ferrari, second in the race course, therefore second in the championship. He has 18 points. Lewis Hamilton has 15. George Russell, also for Mercedes, has 12. Kevin Magnussen there for Haas has 10. Valtteri Bottas for Alfa Romeo with 8. Esteban Ocon for Alpine with 6. Yuki Tsunoda at AlphaTauri with 4. Fernando Alonso at Alpine with 2. And there it is, Zhou Guanyu from Shanghai scoring the first World Championship point of his career, and indeed of any Chinese Formula One driver in history, because he's the only one so far. Right. I think we need to talk a little bit about the technical changes for 2022 because they're massive. It's been described, Craig, as the biggest in a generation, which is a long time, 30 or 40 years. Here they are. Can you kind of, if you like, summarize them and what the intention perhaps is of the regulations?
Well, the whole intention of the regulations was twofold, really. First of all, it was to allow the cars to follow each other much closer. And you notice that I don't use the word make it easier to overtake. It was just to allow a car to run nose to tail with another one. And if you can do that, then with perhaps potentially a little bit of DRS or with just a bold move, then you can make the overtake. So that was the gist of it. Also, it was to try and also manage costs and in the same process just level out the field so that everyone has a fair chance of being competitive, which really hasn't been the case for many years now. So that was the effective aims, and it was done in a proper engineering-led way. So there was a technical team, almost Formula One's 11th team, Ross Brawn, Pat Simmons, Craig Wilson, Jason Somerville, and all the other people now at the FIA actually developed these with CFD, with some wind tunnel. They went to the teams, both themselves and the teams then tested the regulations, went back to the drawing board a bit, went through these cycles, and we've ended up with what I think have worked so far as a pretty robust set of rules. A few little tweaks here and there, but these rules are going to be in place for the next 4 seasons with those potential changes. So I think this is a really good situation.
Lots of things have changed, Craig.
Mm-hmm.
We've got we've got the underbody tunnels, we've got 18-inch wheels, we've got heavier cars, increasingly heavy cars. Sounds like me actually getting increasingly heavy, but that's another story. Cost cap regulations, the wind tunnel regulations. Is it a package, or is there one thing in particular that is really the defining element of the 2022 regs?
I mean, I think it is very much a package. The two kind of biggest things there are, I mean, kind of almost, as much as we talk about these new tyres, the tyres are probably the biggest change for the teams to cope with. It's a massive change for them. They've got simplified suspension to deal with that as well, which has led to this kind of whole porpoising question. And then the way the aero works, particularly with the underfloor tunnels. But I think the big best part of it is the fact that these are a properly rigorously engineered set of regulations for the first time that have really been thought about rather than being a knee-jerk reaction to something or another and not really fully tested. So, it gives you lots of confidence that this is a good direction for the technical and commercial side of the sport going forwards.
And Alex, you're the former F1 driver here. How much different do you think these cars are to drive than the previous generation?
Yeah, I think it'll be quite different. They're heavier. So the big differences are the high-speed corners, not too different. The cars are quite quick to them, but the slower corners, the lot lower cornering speeds. And you can see the drivers playing around with the driving styles a bit. So I think how they rotate the car, how they come off the brake and use the car with stiffer suspension, of course, is going to change how they drive the car. They can't use the curb so hard. They can't trail brake as like they used to, because they'll be always locking up the inside front tire, especially through the slow corners. So there is going to be quite a bit of playing around with the driving style, and of course figuring out the setups. To drivers, that's always going to be the biggest challenge, is trying to get the car into the window, the tires into the window. So how they work that with the engineers as well, because the engineers are also trying to be figuring out what's the best way to drive the cars with the driver. Because you could always set up the car to sometimes suit a particular driver, but it might not be the fastest way to do it. So that's where the engineers and drivers are going to work really hard to figure out, okay, should I drive it this way with this setup? But is it better we maybe go a different direction where I'm not so comfortable, but it's going to be faster for the car? So all these questions are going to be going around, and that's why you're going to get some drivers look a bit unsettled, like Sainz looked unsettled this week. But he can find it. He found it in qualifying. But the fact that he couldn't be as consistent as Leclerc means he's not as comfortable yet. But that's where the big fun is going to all be, with the drivers and the engineers, the trackside engineers working this out.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. It looks like they're very difficult to drive. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we do enjoy very much getting your questions. I know that Alex enjoys when I sort of slightly throw him under the bus with questions. So please, you can see it over here on this side of the screen. At GoF1 Show is our Twitter handle. You can use the hashtag GoF1 to ask questions. We've got a couple of questions that have already come in. One which is aimed at you, Craig, and it's about porpoising, and it's from Andrew Lawrenson in Australia, which is asking, what's Craig's preferred suspension solution for controlling porpoising and maximizing the performance of the floor? He said, for his examples to you, he's kind of semi-engineering the question here, Andrew, was to just run the car at a much higher ride height or solidly mount the suspension. Then he got into progressive spring rates, but I'll hand the question to you for a good answer.
It's a hard question to answer. For those of us who've been to motor racing for a long time, porpoising has been around, and it has been largely aero-led. Something about the underfloor is stalling that creates the bouncing of the up and down at the rear of the car. This year, as I understand, it's much more about the suspension, and the suspension has been massively simplified this year, whereas last year they had inerters, they had gas springs, they had hydraulics, they had asymmetric damping, loads of clever stuff built in, all very mechanical. None of it was active suspension, but loads of tricks in the suspension have all been banned, and all you really have is a fairly conventional damper and a spring to control the rear suspension. And when that falls out of balance with bumps on the track or anything else that's going on with the suspension at the time, then you'll start the pitching, and that sets the aero off, and the two then have a fight, and you just end up with this dreadful porpoising. So I think as much as raising rear ride height is an easy kind of solution, and certainly we saw the Red Bulls and the Ferraris really not grounding at all throughout the race with their cars, whereas the teams that have been struggling a bit more were certainly sparking much, much more. So that's an aspect of it, but really that's a sticking plaster. That's throwing away performance just to get the stability. What you want is the performance and stability together, and that all really comes down to the rear suspension, as was being asked. Now, going for a really solid suspension doesn't help you, because when you get any imperfections, then it's just going to jump up and down even more, and you're going to get even worse porpoising. The solution is how the suspension just starts to get harder towards that very end of the travel, and you don't want it to stiffen up completely. You really kind of got to manage that rising rate quite carefully and leave some compliance there. And the other aspect that comes into that is not so much the springs, but the dampers. Now, with dampers, you've got different settings, and you've got what they call high speed and low speed shaft speed damping. So it's this low speed, and the actual porpoising is only at about 5 hertz, about 5 times a second, which actually when you see it, it looks pretty sickening, but is a key part of that low-speed suspension performance. And that is where I would start to play around with in the damping at that particular low ride height. How the teams do that, I don't know. Now, I know that some of these kind of almost superstar suspension designers who no one else has ever heard of, just kind of geeks like me, some of them have left some of those teams over the past few years, and then maybe they could be feeling a little bit shortchanged by not having, you know, some of these key people on board. But it can be solved, and as I say, I think it is very much more about solving the suspension rather than the aerodynamics. Although, you know, in some situations, almost certainly Mercedes have had some flexing bodywork, which is why you see that stay holding the rear floor in front of the rear tyres upright, because that certainly won't help the porpoising problem.
So it's kind of a case of Back to the Future. We had these problems 30, 40 years ago with ground effect cars. They're back again.
Yeah.
And perhaps people like Adrian Newey, who dealt with them back in those days in Formula One and in IndyCar, has an advantage. We've got another question. I believe we've got it. We can show it on the screen. Here it is. This is the kind of, this is now, Alex, please bear in mind, dear Mr. Marsh, please take a cue from that when you address me in future. But more seriously, there's a couple of questions. I think one that particularly for you is this question about sub 2 second pit stops again. Our friend in Indonesia, Lazwadi, do you think that we'll ever see those again because of the much heavier wheels and tyres?
Sub 2 seconds? Not this year. I seriously doubt it. It's Formula One. There's always going to be development. But you know, the tires are quite a bit heavier. Who knows? Maybe at the end of the year. But I got a feeling we'll start seeing. Maybe we can start getting that territory next year. But you know, we'll see the improvement. But I don't know. But let's see. It is going to be tougher. Maybe they're just going to have to hire bigger mechanics, stronger mechanics.
Yeah, nice one. We've talked
like
about like NASCAR. Exactly.
Right.
It's a very good point.
Yeah.
Very much like NASCAR. I think we've covered the technical regulations. Let's have a look at the Constructors' Championship points to see who. Obviously, we're going to know that Ferrari are top of the charts at the moment because they've had a 1-2 finish today, and of course the fastest lap point. Here are the Constructors' standings. There is Ferrari on. I can't actually read that. 44 points. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah,
27 for
points.
Mercedes. Yeah, 10 for Haas. 27 for Mercedes, 10 for Haas. Alfa Romeo is 4th with 9 points. Alpine is 5th with 8 points. AlphaTauri is 6th with 4 points. And then Aston Martin, Williams, McLaren and Red Bull Racing with no points at all. I was looking at points earlier and thinking about how last year was the first time since, I think, 2008 that the team that won the Constructors' Championship wasn't the team that won the Drivers' Championship. It's kind of unusual. That Mercedes have got, if I'm not mistaken, 124 wins from 250 starts, almost a 50% record. And Red Bull and Ferrari are only at 23%. I know it's slightly skewed by how relatively short Mercedes has been in the championship, but nonetheless. I want to touch on something very briefly, gentlemen, because we're going to look at it in much more detail next week for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix show, which is about the FIA report that finally came out yesterday after qualifying. This is a quick screen grab of some of the 7-page executive summary, which our friend of the Go F1 show, Chris Medland, summarised quite well, and saying that basically the FIA is saying that former race director Michael Massey was acting in good faith. The FIA does admit that human error was the reason why not all the cars were allowed to pass a safety car before the restart, and indeed that the restart shouldn't have taken place until the following lap. But nonetheless, the FIA confirmed that all the results are valid, final, and cannot now be changed. And they obviously made a number of changes for this season, which, as I say, we'll discuss next week. Let's have a look at the 2022 season in particular. Whilst 2021 was a titanic struggle and Lewis Hamilton did get 100 Grand Prix victories, he didn't get his 8th World Drivers' Championship title. So let's look at the records that could be broken in the year 2022. I think one of them here is that, there he goes, Michael Schumacher could beat Lewis Hamilton. Sorry, Lewis Hamilton could beat Michael Schumacher's record that he currently ties. When it comes to most Grand Prix, Fernando Alonso could beat or should beat Kimi Raikkonen. I think that will be if I've got it right, he'll equalise at Monza and beat him at Singapore later this year. Hamilton has the most wins, or will have the most wins, at Hungary and Britain, alongside Michael Schumacher. So if he gets a victory in either of those two races, he goes ahead. Lewis Hamilton, of course, is very much out there in terms of the records, tied with Michael Schumacher at the moment, today, in fact, with the most number of starts with a single team. And Lewis Hamilton could win if he does this season. It'd be in 15 successive seasons, which would beat a Michael Schumacher record. Let's have a look now at the 2022 calendar. Record-breaking season it's set to be. Craig, you said 23 probable. Let's have a quick look at the calendar to see what is coming up next. Here is the schedule. Bahrain, of course, we've just had. Saudi Arabia comes up next. Then Australia over to Melbourne. We go to Imola for round 4, Miami for round 5. It's then Barcelona, Monaco, Baku for round 8, Canada, Great Britain and Austria are 9, 10 and 11. That's just getting us halfway through the season. So we've got a lot of races to get through this year. Craig, putting you slightly on the spot here, do you think that the Russian Grand Prix will be replaced? Will we have 23 races? And if so, what replaces it?
I think it will be replaced. I think there is a drive to have as many races as I think they seem to be able to pack into the season. I don't know what race it will be. There's lots of options. I think Turkey was one of the ones that was being mooted, but in some respects, I'd be happy for it not to be replaced. I think there's too many races in a season for everybody involved in Formula One. You know, the teams, all of the people that work behind the background, not least us in the media. And there was also talk today about, you know, some of the classic races potentially being dropped from the calendar in order to get new, more exciting races in. No one deserves a spot on Formula One's calendar, which I slightly disagree with, not strongly disagree if this was a survey. And yeah, I just think Formula One needs to decide what are they doing with this sport? You know, should a race every 2 weeks for almost the entire year be how you go racing? I think the TV figures and the attendance figures seem to speak for themselves that yes, they do. It should be, but it just somehow, from someone that can remember races of, you know, merely 16 or less races, it feels Formula One is much more of an event when there isn't one, you know, 3 weeks on the trot.
Alex, your view on that?
Yeah, I agree. I'm so not interested about what track's going to be replacing it. It doesn't interest me at all. Someone, you know, unless of course it's here in Malaysia, because then it impacts me directly. But there's so many races this year. I agree with Craig. I think we're saturated. And if it's we have sometimes in esports. If you have tournaments every single week, it loses its star power. So if it doesn't get replaced, great, no problem. And if it does get replaced, okay, yeah. So hope we go somewhere nice.
Yeah, it'd be great if it goes to
Sepang.
Sepang. We could, Sepang.
Yeah.
Everybody says Sepang, but it'll end up. I was going to ask if we got enough races in the Middle East, but I'll shift on from that and ask it in a different way, less tongue-in-cheek, which is Saudi Arabia. It's in a week's time. Massively dramatic race last year. I remember we had on that show, our race debrief show, we had Stefan Johansson, former McLaren and Ferrari Grand Prix driver, who used a brilliant phrase, which was, it's puzzling to me, the track layout. And Alex, who do we think, based on what you've seen now today, Bahrain Grand Prix, who do you think that circuit is going to favour? I know you love being asked this question.
It's going to be Ferrari again. I think that's one of the things we've seen, that the Ferraris, it's going to be a rear limited track again, if I remember this correctly, and if I remember the layout as it is. And I think the traction is going to be key. There's some flat out bits as well. So, we know Red Bull's being quite quick in a straight line here in Bahrain, which will suit it nicely. But I think it's going to be rear limited again, and Ferrari going to be very strong there again.
Do you agree with that, Craig? And
yeah, I agree.
Other than Ferrari, who else? Will Mercedes be better? Do we think anybody else might show, particularly on that racetrack?
Well, I mean, I think the result should look very similar as it was today before the safety car, because hopefully that won't happen again. I think what will be interesting is the teams that have really struggled this weekend, so I'll include Mercedes in that, but equally McLaren, how much progress can they make in a week? And I think this is, what's incredible about Formula One is that I don't think that there's anything on either of those cars that won't be cured suddenly with just something in the setup that just gets that car working to stop the porpoising, the huge amount of grounding that they're getting along the straights and in roll through corners. So I wouldn't be surprised to see one of those teams pop up into much more competitiveness. Certainly, I would expect to find McLaren bounce back because we saw their performance through testing was as good as anybody else. There's certainly nothing fundamentally wrong with the car or with its reliability. So something happened at the Bahrain race weekend they didn't have during the test. And if they can not have that issue for whatever it was, and I look forward to their debrief, when we go to Saudi, we could have a four-way fight for the lead of the championship. That strikes me as entirely reasonable.
And
go ahead.
And Matt, Craig, can I just say though that it is quite startling, isn't it? Because we've had the biggest change of regulations we've had, as you say, Matt, in a generation. How close everything is. Like we're entertaining, and I agree. Even though 1 week is incredibly short, and how much can you change in 1 week? It is still possible because the gaps are not that big, actually. And I find that extraordinary that we have three teams in the hunt straight away, and a couple other teams like McLaren and Haas ain't that too far either, and Alfa Romeo and stuff. So it's quite extraordinary how close the field is, isn't it?
It is, and we're getting towards the end of the show, but questions are coming in, and I'm keen to answer questions from our viewers if we can hold you, Alex and Craig, a little bit longer. I have one question here, which was biggest driver and team surprise today, under or over performer. I think we've covered to some degree the over performers, and I'm going to suggest that the underperformers go, Alex.
Yeah, I just want to quickly touch on Bottas again. He had a terrible first lapper. He fell back to I think it was 17th position. And the recovery, wow, made some overtakes as well. I think he made more overtakes today in the Alfa Romeo than he did all last year in the Mercedes. It was quite impressive to watch. So that was a very understated performance there.
Yes, you're right. He did. He lost 8 places on the first lap, I believe. Got stuck behind Yuki Tsunoda at one point. I did think about that. And that's when Guan Yu Zhou was right behind him. So I think you're right. But I was going to say, and I don't know whether you agree with this, Craig, that underperforming team, bit of a mystery, was the Aston Martin team. A bit of a shout out for Nico Hülkenberg coming in and doing a respectable job. But what on earth is going on with that car?
I don't know. Again, sort of they were one of those teams through the shakedown and testing that you saw they were kind of there or thereabouts. They didn't look like they were in dire straits, but equally they didn't look like they were about to start winning races. And they really went backwards through this race at a rate of knots. And when you consider that you've got, McLaren were having an absolute chronic race, and for me are the underperformers, because really they should have been getting a podium today, given the unreliability of the leaders. What was going on at Aston? I really don't know. I feel it's a team that's rapidly heading towards a bit of a crisis because they've put a lot into preparing for this season. There's a lot of investment. There's a lot of Stroll's money in there. The performance just isn't there in that car. And I don't know if this is one of the situations, perhaps maybe a little bit like Williams, unfortunately, again, another underperforming team, that maybe that concept just isn't right for this year. That other concepts of the car work better under these regulations. It's very, very early to say, and their problems could be something as simple as a little curve in the floor or a couple of clicks of damping on the suspension. But Aston Martin, I'm deeply concerned about, and I really expected more from Williams as well. Someone has to come last. I think overall most underperforming has to be McLaren, because they've gone from podium to the back of the grid.
Well, that was a question from Jonathan Cock on Twitter. So you got more than you bargained for there. You got an overperformer from Alex, and you got 2 or 3 underperformers in Craig's naughty boys list. One more question before you go, Craig. It's on Twitter from Emmanuel Alfonso, and he's asking a lot of talk about different side pods, but is that relevant? Is it the side pod or the floor that's most important?
It's tricky to answer that. Fundamentally, the floor is the performance differentiator on these cars. And getting that floor working is of absolute importance. And the subtle shape of the floor and the edges of the floor and how you work those fences in the front is the fundamental thing that will get these cars working. Then secondary to that, you've got how the front wing sits in front of it and the side pods. Now, the side pods do have an influence on how the floor works. And you can see that everybody's got a different solution, from, you know, Williams' almost non-existent side pods to Mercedes. People call them zero pods. They're not. They're just reshaped side pods. And then you have the McLarens and the Ferraris with big side pods, Red Bulls with the big undercuts. All of them work the floor in slightly different ways, both the front and the back. And yeah, it does make a difference. And probably at this very early stage, it's making more of a difference than perhaps it should do. I think that will all sort of settle down. Teams will get to understand everything a little bit better. I think a lot of testing was lost, the whole porpoising problem. So I think teams are a little bit on the back foot with development. But I don't see anyone out there that couldn't make big leaps at this stage of the regulations with some very subtle changes to their cars. So I don't want to kind of write off solutions too early and say that it's the sideboard that's changed. Because I think already people were saying, oh, Mercedes, they're porpoising, they've got to get rid of their side pods. That's the problem. And it's like, I don't think that's the problem. No. You know, there's other problems there. But I think we will see teams subtly changing the emphasis of their side pods as we go through the year. I think it's just one of those really good visual things that we can kind of get our heads around to try and understand how the cars are working.
Well, that's it. That's all we have time for tonight. I want to many thanks to our special guest, Craig Scarborough. How do we find you on social media, Craig?
The best place is Twitter and Instagram, so it's @ScarbsTech. And watch Tech Talk on F1 TV if you're a subscriber.
There you go. Alex Jung, how do we follow you, and where and how?
Don't follow me. Okay, no, just Alex Jung F1. That's you can find me on Twitter and Instagram as well.
There you go. And you can follow us, of course, on @GoF1 Show. You can watch us, of course, also if you want to now on the web, gofone.tv. If you've tuned in tonight on the Jakarta-Post website, or this morning, or whatever time it is you've tuned in, if you didn't watch us live, terima kasih for doing that. You might have done so on the Sportstar website in India. So Dhanyavad, if you're over there. And wherever you are in the world, stay tuned to us. We'll see you next week. Hope you enjoyed the show.
See you.